Too often, and too easily, by default really, is warfare viewed through a purely detached geopolitical strategic lens, especially when discussing the why and how of the prosecution of it. Personal stakes are limited to individual war stories or that of important leaders who make the important decisions about the war itself. And I detest this. The stakes of warfare, one's entire existence, are simply too fucking high to be subordinated to a world chessboard. This isn't a fucking game. War causes death, period. And we only get one life. And before religious people come in screeching about my afterlife from a reincarnation. While I cannot defend pacifism, since it is a mentality any tyrant can ruthlessly exploit to enslave people, there must nevertheless be a very high bar to justify people putting their lives on the line. Their cause for fighting, to be precise, must be of the utmost importance. The purpose of this essay is the identification of that cause and application of it to determine the merit of a selection of conflicts. The first part is easy enough, for me anyway. Privileged as I am to live in a democratic country, and as detestable as I find dictatorship and its unilateral imposition upon people's lives, I wish for democratic political institutions to continue to exist, thrive, and ideally grow across this planet, so that humans are not inevitably doomed to rule by solitary decree, but have a say in their own political leadership, thus providing a check on abuse of power and, by extension, the possibility for a government to benefit rather than deprive a population. As the best hope for continued improvement in and maximization of, within practical bounds, I do not mean to be utopian here, the quality of human life, therefore, it is necessary to defend such institutions from those who seek to impose arbitrary rule, if you care at all about humanity's condition continuing to improve in the future or even remain constant rather than backslide. I don't even need to make a future generations argument, though I could, because I detest despotism enough that I'd rather be dead than submit to it, and as such, I consider liberal democracy to be worth putting one's life on the line to defend, since it would be preferable to be dead than to surrender our free societies to tyrants and continue to live under that paradigm. This is not my whole argument, however. This would merely justify defense of my own country, but not necessarily that of others, especially if there is no realistic prospect of mine coming under threat. That extension of the argument is based on empathy. I am not a nationalist. I do not only care about myself and people in my own country. I do not want to see people who also enjoy a free society lose it any more than I would want to lose my own. As such, I believe democracies should defend each other as well, not just themselves, one for all and all for one as it goes, though there are practical caveats that must be applied to that statement. My purpose here isn't an in-depth defense of liberal democracy and why you should love it, not that such an argument about an inherently subjective concept would be persuasive anyway, but to, assuming the above as the justification for engaging in armed conflict, evaluate how such a principle would pan out if actually applied. No country has ever actually done so, to be clear, not consistently anyway. I should first point out that I have not chosen the word defense passingly. That wording is very deliberate. Much as I might like to see every dictator's head on a spike, going on an offensive democratic crusade to depose and replace every autocrat on Earth would, even if we pretended nuclear weapons didn't exist, not only be a PR nightmare due to how many people who otherwise might have lived out their lives in peace being killed, and thus driving them out of fear for their lives right into the arms of the despots we want to get rid of, but would have outcomes too uncertain to be worthy of the loss of lives on our side. Imagine citizens of a democratic country fight and die to depose a dictator only for the population of that dictator's country to reveal themselves to not be amicable to democracy anyway. Iraq! how in good conscience can I justify their deaths? What did they die for? A fucking dice roll is what? It's not good enough. Homebrewed revolts are far more promising in terms of freeing unfree countries than external force. Indeed, the latter may be actively counterproductive. Defended, democracy absolutely should be. But to try to impose it, it's simply not worth the risk or the cost. I said earlier there are practical caveats to consider. Even as I declare democracy absolutely should be defended, I am not blind to reality. I realize there are limitations upon our actions that restrict us from acting in an ideal manner. Much as I may want the Americans to roll into Ukraine and start killing every Russian in sight, I recognize that nuclear Armageddon won't secure a better future for anyone, and should be risked only when an established nuclear umbrella is challenged. After all, the whole purpose of nuclear weapons strategically is to prevent conflict between two states from happening at all. Putting democratic countries under a nuclear umbrella, either with their own nukes or those of a nuclear warden, i.e., the USA, is the ultimate deterrent to external aggression against them. Of course, to work, such an umbrella has to exist. Ukraine existed outside of US protection and thus was an open target for Putin. Extending it to them now would be signing up for a nuclear holocaust purely for performative moral reasons. It would not, in any practical manner, save anyone from Putin. As such, while it may seem like the US and others should fight to defend Ukraine directly, the existence of nuclear weapons means that, in reality, such a course of action would be counterproductive. The same is true of the civil war in Myanmar. While the rebels are absolutely in the right to try to depose the junta that removed the elected government, direct US intervention may not just drive the more simple-minded, nationalistic, or fearful into the arms of the junta when they otherwise may have stood aside, but may prompt Chinese intervention. China is notoriously intolerant of American presidents on their frontiers. And the last thing you should want, if you want Myanmar freed of its junta, is to have part of it occupied by the Chinese, thus dooming that part of the country to continued rule by said junta. And all that assumes, of course, that direct conflict with the Chinese would not itself cause a nuclear exchange, which would be obviously even worse than letting the junta win. In both cases, the best course of action is not a bleeding heart leap into the fray, but to act as a lifeline to the good guys doing the actual fighting, to minimize the chance of escalation in order to maximize the chances of an overall beneficial outcome to the fighting. If the Chinese were to intervene to save the junta anyway, support should be escalated in turn, with the rebels soon after found running amok with American anti-tank and anti-air rockets to wage a protracted guerrilla campaign. Again, direct intervention may well lead to a nuclear apocalypse, so indirect methods are necessary. By contrast, Niger most definitely does not have nuclear weapons, nor does it border a hostile nuclear power, so direct intervention is not counterproductive in that case. As such, the coup in Niger against its nascent democratic government should not have been tolerated, and absolutely warranted a response. To see a country finally construct a functional democratic government, complete with peaceful transfer of power after an election, only for it to be almost immediately dismantled by military thugs who believe the fact they have all the guns means they should be in charge, and see no one do anything to stop it, was a tragedy. It's as clear an indication you can get that even Western countries don't really operate on consistent moral principles. Why is democracy in Taiwan worth defending but not in Niger? Just because it's in Africa? Just because Westerners don't care about Africa? The answer is obviously yes, but my point is to make it clear that, morally speaking, the democratic world had an obligation to save Niger from the junta and didn't, because our choice of friends is often, aside from pure realpolitik, based on cultural ties, not morality and not ideology. Of course, the case of Niger brings up another practical restriction. While the junta could absolutely have been deposed, the question of who should have done so is one that is trickier to answer. A major problem that democratic states currently have is that few of them are major military powers, and none of them can really hold a candle to their primary opponents. Poland and Finland may be more capable relative to other European countries, but they are still dwarfed by the Russians and have no chance on their own of fending them off. Europe has, since World War II, relied on the US to back them up against the Russians, but the issue with continuing this strategy into the present is that the US has more commitments than just Europe, and a much, much larger opponent to contend with than Russia. China is such a huge threat, both numerically and economically, that it is simply too great a risk to devote any significant American forces to fighting in Europe, lest the crouching dragon pounce and gobble up the first island chain while they are distracted. That is not to say the US should not fight the Russians. Russia faces the Pacific as well and is a direct threat to Alaska. If their ridiculous claims about Alaska being rightful Russian clay are to be believed, only that it should not be disproportionate. The Chinese are so much greater a threat that the prioritizing of Europe for American efforts would be suicidal, especially since Europe has enough people, land, and resources that it should be able to handle the Russians on its own. At present, however, owing to the lingering free rider problem they inflicted on themselves due to American military protection, they are incapable of actually doing so. Mobilizing Europe to be able to handle the Russians so that the US is free to handle the Chinese is the current great conundrum of European security. European countries are so used to being able to simply let the Americans handle their protection from the rabid bear next door that they have until extremely recently proven reluctant to shoulder any greater responsibility for it. Indeed, even after Ukraine was invaded, many still aren't, not substantially. Countries like Germany, despite their rhetoric, are more focused on military virtue signaling by sending token weapon shipments to Ukraine at the expense of their own stockpiles, rather than making any sort of serious effort to remilitarize themselves. The same is true of the Brits, whose own military forces are still anemic and crutch heavily on having nuclear weapons and following the Americans around wherever they go to get a little piece of the pie. And whenever the topic of having Europe handle itself rather than rely on the Americans is brought up, European leaders go into a panic about it and start rattling off all kinds of excuses as to why the US should keep defending Europe rather than Europe defending itself. It seems to me they could care less if Taiwan is gobbled up so long as they don't have to ramp up their own defense spending. To circle back to Niger, it is not merely that Europe needs to be able to handle their own defense. It is not merely that they need to accept that China, not Russia, is the current big bad, and they shouldn't expect the Americans to drop everything to save a Europe that refuses to properly defend itself. It is also that, well, Africa exists. While much of the continent is run by despots, that is not always true, and where it isn't, those countries deserve a helping hand, countries like Niger. And given that the Americans are already responsible for both the Americas and the Pacific, facing down in the process our most formidable adversary, it does not seem unreasonable to ask that rather than Africa being yet another place for the US to spread itself thin, it should be within Europe's division of our collective defense. France, after all, maintained quite a substantial presence in Africa after decolonization until quite recently. Their refusal to commit to any serious conflict on the continent has allowed it to steadily fall to Russian allied forces, however. If anyone should be tasked with defending fledgling democratic governments in Africa from yet more coups, it should be the French, though it would not be unfair for others to help out as well, especially the Brits, who are the next most capable of expeditionary warfare. Although it should be kept in mind that French presence in West Africa is somewhat of a sore spot for some of the people there, so whether they would necessarily be the best choice for such an intervention, even if they were best positioned to do so, is debatable. The problem with this sort of solution currently, anyway, is that France is also needed for continental defense, since Germany is utterly incapable of meaningfully defending Eastern Europe from the Russians. To be able to both have the forces to hold Poland and have an expeditionary force in Africa would require an expansion of the French military to compensate for Germany being useless. And while unfair, I frankly don't foresee Germany changing tack anytime soon, as they are politically and culturally crippled when it comes to their attitude towards being a major power. Unfortunately, they're literally right in the middle of Europe, so everyone else has an interest in defending Germany from the Russians, even if the Germans refuse to defend themselves. They can get away with being a deadweight in the same way Denmark, Canada, and Iceland can, being guaranteed American protection due to their geography being critical to the defense of the United States itself. I'm not saying it's right that these countries freeload, it never will be, only that other countries who have a strategic stake in their geography, the US and Canada, France and Germany, etc., have no choice but to defend these countries regardless of how little they bother to defend themselves. I feel I should, before continuing, tackle an obvious and indeed potent criticism of this approach, given it is predicated on defending democracy. Namely, at what point on the scale between autocracy and democracy do I consider a country democratic enough to be worthy of defense? Democracy isn't a binary state. Different countries are democratic to greater or lesser extents. I admit there is no clean way to delineate this, and my personal cutoff points will be just that, personal. But there is no alternative. There must be a line somewhere, and it should be rather generous. After all, if I were being puritanical about it, I could not even justify defending Canada or Britain, for instance. Those countries have multi-party elections, but first past the post voting, leading to majority governments installed by less than 40% of the electorate. But 40% is still better than zero, and there is at least still a fair and free election happening, even if the way people insist on conducting it makes it unrepresentative. It is better than a dictator or some exclusive oligarchy like apartheid South Africa. In the interest of fleshing this line out further, consider some examples. Orban's Hungary is apparently still democratic. The state is illiberal but does not appear to rig elections, not yet anyway, though it is one to keep an eye on. I would not put it past someone like Orban to eventually start rigging elections if he was under serious threat of losing. Japan is in a similar boat, with the Liberal Democrats having controlled the country nearly continuously since the American occupation ended, yet they do not appear to rig elections either. In both cases, I would still stand by their defense. They possess functioning democratic electoral processes that could allow the opposition to gain power, which is the most critical element of keeping a democratic country democratic in the first place. Once ballot boxes start getting stuffed or opposition parties start getting banned, the presence of elections is no longer appropriate to call the country democratic. Most civilian despots have elections as it is, they simply rig every single one. The effort also needs to be systematic and permitted. If someone stuffs a ballot box for the ruling party and they end up in prison for it anyway, the system is still functioning properly. Verifying whether elections are being rigged is thus very important to determining eligibility here, and naturally, wannabe despots will do their best to obfuscate doing so. I am, for instance, quite confident Venezuelan and Russian elections are rigged, but they do a good enough job hiding it that the more ignorant or easily fooled may think otherwise. I am less confident about a place like Bangladesh, but its backsliding on democratic norms is even more severe than Hungary's, and I already find Hungary harder to stomach. It's possible Bangladesh's elections are already being rigged, and given its numerous other violations of what a liberal would consider to be human rights, I would be hesitant to defend such a system. Cases of non-universal suffrage are also tricky. For instance, Israel. Most of the population are citizens who participate in a democratic society, but a large minority are effectively colonial subjects with no rights, citizenship, or political representation. Were Israel to simply extend citizenship to all who live within its borders, it would be easy for me to say they are 100% worth defending. Yet their steadfast refusal to enfranchise those people means the country is literally only somewhat over halfway democratic, purely by the number of people allowed to vote. It's better than apartheid South Africa in that respect. There, a vast minority lorded over a vast majority, but it is still a fundamentally unfair arrangement. As such, I find Israel worthy only of conditional support, As I've said before, Israel's enemies are even worse than it, so in terms of which side of a conflict to back, I'm always going to take Israel's. But if you're asking whether any Canadian, American, Frenchman, or Italian should put their lives on the line for Israel, I would say only if its existence is at stake. And no, Israel itself should not be the judge of that, obviously. They will screech that any perceived threat is an existential one. Israel has political institutions that would function as a foundation for a truly democratic society. The problem is their exclusivity. Nevertheless, they exist, and so I'm not keen to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater by enemies even more despicable and even less democratic than them. Luckily, this is largely a hypothetical scenario. Israel has nuclear weapons, so it is able to deter existential threats to itself, same as any other nuclear power. As such, a scenario where other countries need to save them is implausible. They are more than capable, currently, of ensuring their own survival. If Israel did not have nuclear weapons, then I could make the argument for direct intervention to save Israel as a last resort if indirect support is not sufficient. Even then, a previous caveat would apply. The US, if anything, needs to be less involved in the Middle East in order to tackle China. So if Israel needed bailing out, someone else, probably in Europe, should be doing it. You might ask if I would have said the same for apartheid South Africa or Rhodesia, but the answer is no. Those countries were extremely minoritarian and race segregated, so the black majority could not really be blamed for, as in Rhodesia, turning to the communists out of desperation. That is not to say communism would actually free anybody, it wouldn't, but that doesn't make the racist shitbags running the place worthy of defense, especially from countries which were not racially supremacist. How in good fucking conscience could I ever ask a black American to lay down his life to defend Rhodesia because communism and because the tiny white ruling class have the right to vote among themselves? That would be grotesque. Again, I get the chessboard argument. The rebels were being backed by the Soviets and the Chinese, so they really had no moral leg to stand on, and fighting them by proxy is fine by me. But such outrageous oligarchies as Rhodesia would never be worthy of defense by citizens of an egalitarian democracy. On that note, I'd like to go through a few historical conflicts to judge whether the direct involvement of a democratic country's military was, or would have been, warranted. This is not an exhaustive list, nowhere close, merely a few more recent examples. Going back even a couple hundred years muddies the waters significantly, as even the most democratic countries like Britain or the United States were functionally electoral oligarchies where only landowners were represented. Better than the absolute monarchies that had been standard fare for human authority up to that point, granted, but hardly inspiring for a modern patriot. Since the Americans are the most major democratic military power, I will be largely focusing on them. The appropriate application of American military force has been a perpetual debate for the country's entire existence, so I'm hardly picking on it. Consider the Gulf War. Western military nerds love it for good reason, but the tiny American death toll is irrelevant. The question is, what did any of them die for? And what did the rest of them risk, though not lose, their lives for? It seems in the gloating about their stupidly lopsided victory, most Americans have forgotten that the Gulf War was fought to keep Saddam Hussein's hands off of Kuwaiti and possibly Saudi oil. It was a war to defend Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, both countries ruled by dictators no better than Saddam and in some ways maybe worse. Given a fight between two autocrats, it's pretty easy to paint the one that starts the war as being in the wrong. It's better to be oppressed in peace than oppressed and also fighting for your life, but that doesn't mean the Emir of Kuwait or the King of Saudi Arabia are worthy of protection by American soldiers. It's frankly disgusting to ask someone from a free country who can vote for their own leadership to lay down their life to defend one dictator from another. They are utterly unworthy of that level of sacrifice. I get the oil dimension, but putting people's lives on the line is way, way too far. Giving the Saudis weaponry to fight off Iraq is as far as it should have gone. Desert Storm was totally unjustified. This same logic applies to the famous trio of Asian dictators the US intervened to defend in the Cold War: Syngman Rhee, Chiang Kai-shek, and Ngo Dinh-Diem. All three were right-wing despots against communist counterparts, and in all three cases they were so incompetent and so despised by their own population they were nearly defeated before being bailed out by the United States military. Except for Diem. He was so bad that he was couped by the CIA, and it was the junta that replaced him that the US ended up bailing out. Because of Red Scare paranoia. The logic seemed to be that fighting communism, regardless of context, was worth Americans giving their lives for. If it's not obvious by now, I vehemently disagree. It's one thing to defend a democratic country from a communist attack, but South Korea, nationalist China, and South Vietnam were decidedly not, much as the US government may have tried to pretend they were. Ergo, the same standard I applied to Kuwait applies to them. A dictator is not worthy of the lives of a democratic nation being lost to defend them. Neither the US intervention in Korea, nor the concurrent blocking of the Taiwan Strait and protection for Chiang, nor the US intervention in Vietnam, yes, even the small-scale one under Kennedy, small or not, there were still American soldiers being put in mortal danger, were justified. The later democratization of South Korea and Taiwan is not relevant to the calculation, as no one at the time could have known that would happen, especially since the US itself made no effort to actually force either country to be democratic. Using the present condition of those countries is post hoc and can only be done with hindsight. At the time, it would have been pure speculation and fantasy, hardly worthy of anyone laying their life down for. By contrast, however, there was a situation where war was justified, but not taken. Czechoslovakia. In 1948, the Communist Party, staring down an electoral defeat in that year's elections, purged the opposition and turned the country into a one-party state, bringing it in line with other Soviet satellites and, naturally, the Soviet Union itself. That was a clear-cut attack on an existing democratic government and should, were morality truly a factor, have been opposed by the Western Bloc with force, but it was not. Now, one could argue that the US had gutted its conventional army and therefore was not in a position to go to war with Stalin over it, but that in itself is a moral failure and does not change the fact that they should have maintained a sufficient standing army to actually fight the Soviets and therefore should then have intervened to save Czechoslovakia. The exact same logic applies a decade earlier, in fact. Britain and France, citing their unpreparedness for war, allowed Hitler to take down the democratic Czechoslovakia without a fight. That too was a moral failure, both in not intervening at all and in not maintaining a military capable of such an intervention. They then, ironically, went to war with Hitler over his invasion of the non-democratic Poland. Had Poland been invaded first, I would say this actually wasn't warranted, but since they should have intervened in Czechoslovakia beforehand, the Allies were justified in going after Hitler at any point after that. Actually, if you think about it, they were justified in going after him at any point after Hindenburg died and he made himself dictator, since he obviously destroyed German democracy in the process. But they were too war-averse and too unprepared at that point to dare, much as I would have liked to see it. It's worth noting that, by the same logic, using Korea as a similar excuse to escalate to a war with Stalin could also have been justified, but Truman explicitly tried to avoid a fight with the Soviets, and thus that war has to be judged for what it was, a defense of Syngman Rhee, and not what it could have been. You might wonder why starting World War III with Stalin was justified, but starting it now with Putin is not, and the reason is a practical one: mutually assured destruction. MAD was not a thing back then, as ICBMs were not yet a viable delivery platform for nuclear weapons. They had to be dropped from bombers, which meant you had to establish air superiority over the target and have bombers with the range to actually reach it. The Soviets had essentially no prospect of annihilating the United States with nukes at that point, as they would have been hard pressed to even maintain air control over their own territory, let alone their opponents. So the prohibitive cost that exists currently vis-a-vis a fight with the Russians did not exist back then, thus making it a viable course of action. It wasn't until the 60s that MAD really came into effect. At that point, being proactive in putting countries under the American nuclear umbrella became paramount, as if a country outside that umbrella was attacked by the Soviets, there was no way to save it without signing up for a nuclear apocalypse. And that paradigm continues to this day. It's also why any ambiguity over American commitment to defend Taiwan must end. If the Chinese believe they have a free hand to invade Taiwan, they will put the US in the same position we currently have in Ukraine, where direct action to save them is not possible once the war has started because the enemy possesses nuclear weapons. This would be even worse if the US actually does intend to defend Taiwan, but does not say so out of fear of antagonizing the Chinese, since that would directly cause a nuclear exchange due to a misrepresentation of their own intentions. I won't pretend this essay has been anything more than wishful thinking, given I hold no political power myself, but I feel it necessary to recommend this standard for war all the same. Submitting entirely to realpolitik is itself an ideological stance, much as realists may insist it isn't. So if I'm doing anything new, it's in wanting to apply military force for the purpose of upholding democratic political institutions rather than pure national interest. However, the present leadership of a country chooses to define that anyway. I feel that the misallocation of military force, especially by the United States, for most of the last century has undermined the commitment most Americans, and in many cases Europeans, have to defending their own supposed values outside their own country. Just look at their struggle to get people to volunteer for the military these days, which is a catastrophic problem because the US military is unironically the only hope many smaller democracies have of surviving long term. And the US doesn't even have enough forces or resources to defend them all, even if it chose to. People need to know that if they're asked to put their lives on the line, it's for people like them, free citizens of a free country, not to defend a despot from some other despot because his country is in a strategic location, or he has some oil or ore that we want, or his enemy is friends with our enemy, or any other cynical, self interested cause detached from the very ideology a democratic state is supposed to embody. Because what concerns me is that we're demoralizing our own populations, making them less likely to bother defending themselves or each other, playing right into the hands of anti-Western propaganda, and allowing democracy to be rolled back country by country due to our own unwillingness to fight for it. We need to convince ourselves by actually doing so that we really are fighting the good fight and for a good cause, because otherwise we're going to lose it.